Welcome to the Freedom to Learn podcast. I'm your host, Ginny Gentles. This season, we're diving into what it means to return education to states, communities, and families. And we're exploring what becomes possible when education is freed from union dominance and federal control. A new federal tax credit could dramatically expand educational opportunities for millions of students next year. Jim Blue and Peter Murphy join the podcast to describe how the new Education Freedom Tax Credit will incentivize private donations to scholarship granting organizations, or SGOs, empowering parents to choose the schools and services that meet their children's needs. They tackle the union's false talking points, walk through how coalition building helped pass the law and shape the rulemaking process, and they make the case for why governors should opt in so families in every state can benefit. We also cover public school student participation, homeschool student access, and what needs to happen before implementation. Jim Blue is co-founder and board member with the Defense of Freedom Institute and advisor to the Federal Scholarship Tax Credit Coalition. Peter Murphy is the vice president for policy for Invest in Education. Well, Peter Murphy and Jim Blue, welcome to Freedom to Learn.
Thanks for having us.
Let's start with your elevator pitches on what the Federal Scholarship Tax Credit is. Jim, let's start with you. How do you describe it?
So it depends on who's the audience in an elevator. But in general, if I'm talking to somebody who cares about improving our American education system, I start with this tax credit is our greatest opportunity to improve the academic and life outcomes for America's K-12 children. No exaggeration. It accomplishes this by putting billions of dollars of scholarships into the hands of families in the form of K-12 scholarships that can be used for a variety of education expenses, everything from tutoring to tuition. And by giving families more power over how their children get educated, we will, just with doing that, improve the outcomes. But there's also a residual competitive effect by giving our traditional public schools an incentive to improve.
In short, the federal scholarship tax credit is a income tax incentive to drive private donations to scholarship granting organizations, which in turn award scholarships to parents to choose the school or the educational good or service that best meets their child's educational needs. So it incentivizes private funding of education, of parent-directed education, to choose a school or, again, the service that's best for them. And it's empowering. It's financially empowering, and it's a great equalizer among more and more families who can access education that best meets their children's needs.
All right, so I live within the Beltway in Washington, D.C., and what I hear in the teacher union talking points that are echoed by certain members of Congress is that this is a national voucher program. How do you all respond to that?
Yeah, that's absurd. I mean, in short, it's driving more private funding into education, and parents with children in any school setting can take advantage of this. Well, the vast majority of children are in public schools. The vast majority of the beneficiaries will be public school students. So this idea of a voucher, this dreaded word is just ludicrous. It's a talking point. It's a thoughtless way to describe this. We have tax incentives for businesses, for home ownership. Now we have one for education, where children in every school setting can now benefit. That's fundamentally what this is.
Yeah, let me build on what Peter's saying, because the reason they're trying to mischaracterize this as a voucher program is to, taint it, essentially. And here's the reality. Vouchers are directly funded out of appropriations. This is not funded that way. It's funded through private donations. Vouchers typically only serve private school students. This will serve all students, including students in traditional public schools. There's just a variety of technical differences, but let's just recognize that they're doing it for propaganda reasons. They want to call it vouchers because they've spent millions of dollars vilifying vouchers over the decades. Let me add something to this, Jenny. If any study you read or anybody starts out by calling this a federal voucher scheme, you're about to be lied to. And everyone should understand that because it's all spin after.
Many organizations and individuals contributed to the creation of this federal scholarship tax credit, and you both work within broader coalitions. I'd like to know a little bit more about the origin story, how it came about. Because another talking point from the teachers unions and the politicians who use the talking points of the teachers unions is that the billionaires wanted a federal voucher scheme. They told Congress and they got it in the One Big Beautiful Bill Act.
I think the first point to make is yes, Peter and I have two separate coalitions that are working toward the same thing. It's really important. We're not in conflict about our goal here, and both of our coalitions are working towards successful implementation of the federal tax credit in every state in Washington, D.C.
Well, first of all, just as to the original thing you asked about this accusation in terms of billionaires or how this actually passed Congress, the biggest supporters of school choice and education freedom are consistently, over the decades, really, every poll, minority families, low-income families support this. Why? Because it gives them the opportunity for their children that rich people have, that children from wealthy households have. So polling consistently shows low-income minority families are recurring, consistent supporters of this. So passing a law is what they support and what meets their needs educationally. So you start with that. And so Congress stepped in, passed this law because of, for many reasons, but the coalition that was established, working with people like Greg Brock, who we both worked with over the years. Greg worked with Invest in Education Coalition, and he and I set about for 3 years in a very intense way, building on and expanding this coalition so members of Congress would see that voters and residents in their own states and their own communities that these organizations represented wanted this law. So that's ultimately why Congress passes things, because the polling shows something favorable and their own voters represented by these coalition organizations wanted it as well. That was very important to get this passed by Congress.
Jim, love to hear about the origin story of the Federal Scholarship Tax Credit Coalition and a little bit more about your history of working on this issue.
Our group came about really informally when we saw the bill that was finally passed. There were a lot of last minute changes in the bill that Peter and his group had been advocating for years. And when we looked at this new bill, there were some curveballs in it about like, well, now what are we going to do? How do we make sure this is successfully implemented across the country? That is a diverse group of people who've worked together for years on the federal tax credit. Some of us were a part of the first Trump administration, working with Betsy DeVos and what was called the Education Freedom Scholarship. And that was the very first attempt to get a scholarship bill passed, a federal tax credit scholarship. Those groups, by the way, include like Greg Brock. Greg Brock works with us right now. John Schilling, who is former AFC president, but it also includes the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops, Agudath Israel of America, a whole variety of people on our steering committee. I should mention, of course, Ed Choice, that works for scholarship tax credits across the country. And we realized that what we needed to do was educate the public, particularly the people out in the states. We need to help them understand what was going on so that they could have intelligent input into the rulemaking process, so that the Treasury rules would reflect their input directly from them.
Before we go to the rulemaking, which is definitely a topic we need to dig into today, I'd like to know who you guys are talking about. Peter, when you're talking about the coalition that you all spent years putting together, and Jim, when you're talking about people in the states, who is that? SGOs would be an example, but who and what are SGOs?
Scholarship granting organizations, there are literally hundreds of these in various sizes across the country, several of which are part of the coalition from the beginning. You have religious organizations, school associations are a major part of the coalition, public policy organizations, and you know, so there's a very good variety of this. And we reached a point where, look, Congress passes things because voters want them through action, through when they hear it from back home and they see it in the polling, and they also believe in the merits. But the merits is only one reason they do something. The voters have to support it. And so it was our job as a coalition to make that clear that this was, this was really wanted by their voters. We were competing at the time with a lot of other issues. So the reconciliation bill, which this was part of, the federal scholarship tax credit was part of, had literally dozens and dozens of issues in there. So we had to compete with a lot of other priorities that Congress had. And fortunately, we made it to the end. And as Jim mentioned earlier, there were some changes. And that was because the parliamentarian of the Senate who weighs in on this kind of legislation, what's called reconciliation bills, that needed a simple majority to pass the Senate. So it had a very narrow collection of rules that this bill had to comply with. And so the parliamentarian originally removed the bill entirely because it didn't comply, supposedly. And a number of us pushed back on that. And the Senate leadership got it back in. And this was literally the last weekend before the bill finally passed. It was an insane process. But the upshot of it was that because of parliamentarian rules, which in my view were arbitrary and ridiculous, nevertheless, that made certain changes that made the bill not as strong and robust as the Educational Choice for Children Act, the original bill that the House had passed. But nonetheless, it was a bill that was workable enough to benefit millions of children for years to come. And to make that a reality, we have to take a number of steps as a coalition, in particular the SGO operators, to make sure that those regulations that are going to implement this legislation are robust and will enable states across the country to adopt this and make it a reality for families throughout the nation.
Jim, back to this conversation about who you all are working with around the country. Again, I want to push back on this narrative that's so common among the unions within DC, that there's just, a handful of people who want this. Both of your organizations had webinars recently, and we'll talk about why. Hundreds of people from around the country logged in for those webinars. So, Jim, could you give us examples beyond the ones that Peter mentioned of who's engaged in this process right now?
Right. So here is a slight difference between our approaches. When we looked across the country, we saw that there would be lots of groups that would be interested in taking advantage of these scholarships. That included the charter school sector, the traditional public school sector. A lot of them have education foundations with their districts. They'd want to get extra support for their children who need tutoring, for example. We also looked at the after-school programs. Those are explicitly allowed. Extended day programs are allowed in the definition. And there's just all sorts of providers there of in academic enhancements for children. So our approach has been to go out to not only the original core group that Greg and Peter put together while the bill was getting passed, but to expand it to a much larger group of people who care about this. And like you said, we ended up having 700 people on that webinar, but it was also representing thousands more because everybody on that webinar is a leader of one of these organizations that's interested in taking advantage of the program. I want to emphasize, we're talking traditional districts who are seeing the benefits of this. There is a split going on right now. The unions came out with a letter saying, please, Democratic governors, please don't do this. The reason they're targeting Democrats is because districts in Republican states are already mobilizing. They're taking advantage of this program. And I believe, will raise the bulk of the money because they have bigger numbers. They have better lists of people, their own employees, for example. So they're going to immediately be able to take advantage of that and get these $1,700 tax credited donations up and running.
Peter, you all as a coalition have been working in states to encourage governors to opt in. Can you give some examples of how you're pushing back on these letters? Oh no, letters that are discouraging Democrat governors from participating, and what you're doing to encourage them to understand what this is going to offer and understand what they're going to be giving up if they don't opt in?
This law is the biggest education bonanza for children in 60 years since the feds enacted what's called the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. It's the biggest bonanza for public education in 60 years. And it's right there for the taking. And so we have made this, and as you mentioned, there's opposition to it. There's pushback because it benefits families in a way that's outside the traditional district system, the traditional bureaucratic system. You're empowering parents financially to have a greater role in the direction and content of their child's education. That's what's happening. Wealthy people can do that. Upper middle class can do that. Lower and working class and middle class people have a much tougher time doing that financially. This is empowering them financially. That's outside the system. Again, most of those parents will have children in public schools, but they can access tutoring, special needs services, English language learning instruction, things that are outside that their school may be falling short upon. And ironically, if a district school parent can access those kinds of services and stay in district school, that makes district school more appealing if they can actually access those services through this law. So it's a huge bonanza. And the issue that we are trying to get across with governors is, first of all, we've had events in a number of these states around the country with organizations, with subsets of these coalition organizations, and which has expanded very organically. The coalition that helped pass the bill has since expanded because now the bill's there, and so people are sort of jumping on board and seeing its benefits, and that's a good thing. And so we're showing governors that, look, a lot of your constituents want this. It's not a narrow, segmented, coalition of people, but in fact, it's quite expansive and quite diverse. And if you, as governors, do not participate in this federal program, which is one of these wrinkles the parliamentarian added at the very end, that governors were made gatekeepers of this, they have to opt in a way that like Medicaid expansion, they had to opt in different states, and most of them did, some didn't. In this case, it's governors who have to opt in. 30 have done so. 20 still have not to this date. By opting in, you are enabling your resident children to benefit in your state by opting in, by getting those scholarships, most of whom will be in public school. If you don't opt in, the taxpayers in a given state that doesn't opt in can still donate. They're just going to donate to some SGO in another state that has opted in. So it's a huge revenue loss for governors who don't opt in if they agree and go along and parrot this very selfish, mendacious opposition that we're hearing.
Multiple organizations have maps that are tracking which states have opted in, which states have opted in officially, which ones have indicated that they're probably going to. So an example of a Democratic state that has opted in officially would be Colorado, a state where the Governor Hochul, has indicated that she's probably going to opt in would be New York. We have a map like that at the DFI, Defense of Freedom Institute website, and so people can follow along. What else are you guys talking to the governors, to their staff about when it comes to making this opt-in decision?
Yeah. So we make the same points to Republicans and Democrats, but we want to acknowledge it's a more difficult conversations with Democrats, and people should understand why. The labor unions that represent teachers and other government workers represent them in elections, and they're a superpower in the Democratic Party. You are putting their political life at risk if you go against them. Democrats know that, which is why they put out a letter. Tim, you were sort of making fun of, well, are they really afraid of a letter? No, they're not afraid of a letter. They are afraid of their political machine.
Yes.
We recognize that reality as we're approaching Democrats. I should say we, because our belief is the right way to do this is to have people who are close to the government come talk to them. First of all, explain the program to them, because so often all they're hearing is from Democratic operatives who work for the unions. And so once they begin to understand 4 points, and they're pretty much the same points Peter made. One is every kid will benefit in your state from this program. Number 2, it won't cost your state budget anything. So don't listen to this like it's going to be destroy K-12 funding. These are charitable dollars on top of what's already been spent. Number 3, this is really popular with voters. Again, the union has all kinds of machinations about how it's not really, but if you do any polling, even Democrats are saying 2 to 3, they like this bill. And then, at that point, we say, oh, and by the way, the substantive point Peter made, if you don't accept scholarship, if you don't allow scholarships to be given in your state, people can still get a federal tax credit by contributing to another state. So you're literally going to see money lose. So those are the points we make repeatedly through a variety of different vehicles to help the governors here and their staff here from all kinds of sides. This is the truth. You can check us out. That's the reality. Now you're going to have a very tough decision because we know one of your political supporters is going to be upset with you when you do this.
A lot of these governors can call the unions bluff. Kathy Hochul's, in effect, has done that in New York because she's done a lot for public education, especially this year in this year's budget in New York. So an effective governor is a governor of all the people, and you can balance interest. That's how we had a lot of these school choice laws to begin with. It's just vital to put children first and realize that no governor would ever refuse bridge and tunnel funding from the federal government or Title I or Title II education funding from the federal government. Likewise, they should not refuse this funding, private funding, that adds to what's already there. It's inconceivable to forego this kind of support, and that's really what they're grappling with. And so they're going to wait for the regulations from the U.S. Treasury to formally get issued, hopefully by September, and then I think we'll see a lot of more decisions being made on opting
Jim,
in.
what do you think about that? I know some of the Democratic governors have been saying that we're waiting to see what the rules say. We're waiting for the regulations. Do you think those remaining 20 or so states, we're not going to see movement until then?
So that's one theory. Peter's articulated that none of those governors are going to do anything until they see the written final rules that will be in effect for 2027. We don't think that's necessary. We look at the preview of the rule, and our own assessment is governors have everything they need to opt in, just as the 30 states who have opted in realize. At this point, it's looking more like an excuse not to opt in. Many of them, Ginny, I think were hoping that Treasury would somehow allow them to cut out private and religious schools from the mix. And Treasury's now been very clear. If that's your reason, if you're going to deny benefits to the 90% of children who are not going to take advantage of private and religious schools, to keep that 10% out, you go ahead and do that, and there could be political consequences for that. But on the whole, I don't think that's even where Democratic governors were. I think they really wanted to appreciate, will it really serve all children? And yes, the answer is totally. Is it going to be a big burden on me? No, actually, it turns out you can use third-party auditors to make sure people are complying with the law. So they have all of their answers. We'll be encouraging them to start opting in now because time matters here. This is something that gets lost in the debate. SGOs will need time to ramp up, to be ready to start fundraising, to be able to design scholarships, process application, and get benefits to students. They really should have been starting already. Every month we go by, it makes the successful implementation more and more difficult.
So you mentioned Treasury previewed the rules recently. What was this preview, and how can people find out more about some of those specific provisions that Jim was referencing?
So Treasury has done several things during the regulatory process that are not required by law. They solicited comments from from the public back in December, which they didn't have to do, but they wanted input. They want to get this right, and they've really been very deliberative and gotten very constructive input from both coalitions and various other people to get this right. So this preview that they did in early June was a way of saying, here's the direction we're going in on a number of key areas, which gives us an opportunity to come back at them and say, yes, we agree, or no, we don't agree, and we think maybe you should do something differently. One of the issues that's come up is whether all the homeschool kids in all 50 states will be able to be scholarship recipients. They should be, but Treasury's taking it in a certain direction that puts that in potential jeopardy in states where homeschoolers are not considered private schools. That's an issue that's still out there to be resolved. Scholarship organizations have to spend 90% of their income on scholarships so they don't hoard cash. That's a good provision, but that still needs to be defined, and it's going in a very positive direction from the preview. So we know that, but we still have to, again, take this opportunity in the next few weeks to offer recommendations to ensure that makes for an effective implementation of the law. So again, Treasury's really going out of its way to get this right and to get input from people who share their interest in seeing this successful and reaching millions of children for years to come.
We'll put a link to the Treasury preview document, which has that kind of concise summary of what they're thinking, where they're heading on each of these kind of hot topics. But Jim, what other resources would you point people to so that they understand Treasury's thinking, so that they understand what's happened and what's going to happen next?
Let me just preview. We're going to be doing yet another website. There's several good websites out there, including the one that Invest in Education has, that will give people information, the basics of the law. Our own website is going to be much more of a how-to, if you will, telling people exactly the steps they need to take. So whether you're a governor, a taxpayer who wants to donate, a family that wants a scholarship. Most of the issues have been resolved, and that's something we should focus on here. But there are a few issues that have not been resolved. And those are the things we'll be waiting for in the final rule. We can tick those off if it's helpful to people. One of those is, how are we going to handle married couples filing jointly? When most lay people, meaning tax experts, read the language of the law, they expected there not to be a marriage penalty, and that each member of a couple could make a $1,700 contribution and receive a credit for it. So we're all hoping that Treasury will decide that it gets to be the $3,400. That will mean billions of dollars of additional money for scholarships. So I think we're all in favor of that. We don't yet know the forms, deadlines, all of that around the governor's process. So this is the one area where a governor can say, well, I haven't seen the form yet. I don't know what my deadline is. And that's all true. Until Treasury puts out its final rule and has that in place, we don't really know what to do.
Well, Jim, you're saying that, but close to 30 governors have already formally opted in. So there is a temporary interim process for that. Yes.
There are two steps in the process. Thank you for pointing out. One is to opt in, to say, we are going to be participating so children can get scholarships in 2027. The next step is you have to provide the list of SGOs who operate in the state and comply with the law. So that's the next. So we need some deadlines and process forms around that. And then the final thing is, a lot of people are looking for Treasury to tell us more about how employees can withhold from their paychecks the amount of money that they're going to contribute to scholarship granting organizations. This will it will make fundraising a lot easier. We'll get money into the coffers of scholarship organizations early. And finally, it will allow us to address fraud and abuse in a really efficient, correct way early on.
With this rules process, and you mentioned specifically the issue with the homeschooler participation, are you seeing evidence of engagement with Treasury, again, from a grassroots perspective?
Yeah, we are definitely seeing that. We're actually helping make it happen. You're talking about a really sort of technical issue, but the way that they interpreted Coverdell and the list of expenses in there implied that student had to be in a school as defined by a state. We don't think they intended to say that, and we're going to be making our best effort to explain that's actually not what the law says. The law says every child who's eligible to enroll in elementary and secondary school should be eligible for a scholarship unless you fail the means test. I think you understand that the very high income families in this country cannot get the scholarship. So that's a technical issue. I know the homeschooling, micro schooling, co-ops, all of the innovative models out there are very concerned about this. I just think we give Treasury all the information they need to make the right decision on this, including from the homeschoolers themselves.
Peter, your thoughts on this?
Well, so our approach with Treasury is not so much a grassroots effort with the coalition organizations like it was with Congress, because Congress is concerned about voters and grassroots impact there. This is more, we're bringing SGO operators and implementers, nonprofit organizations, to bring their expertise to the Treasury Department officials so they're fully aware of how this works and what makes it work and what might inhibit it from working well. So the homeschool thing is a good example where homeschool groups are weighing in on this and to make sure that they get it right, and Treasury is very solicitous of that. So they want to get this right, and we think, we're hopeful it will be, but again, the law is something that we would have written a little differently going forward, but it's still a very viable, workable law to benefit children in the long run. We just hope that nobody gets left out who should be part of this. And homeschool is a very open question right now, whether they will be included in every state. They should be. That's the case we're making, and we'll see how it plays out.
So, Ginny, I would like to talk about the other edge of this two-edged sword for just a second. The other implication of what they said, and again, we don't think they meant what they said, quite literally, but the other implication is that if you read what they said literally, it would mean that you had to be a school in order to be a provider of educational options. And if you think about that, that would take out of the equation all of the girls and boys clubs, scouting, YMCA, all of these other groups that would provide after school services, extended day services, kind of in competition with the traditional school districts. And so we don't think they meant to do this, but that's the other piece of this that we're getting clarified. Did you really mean to say you had to be a school in order to be an educational provider? We'll be clarifying that with, again, all of these groups.
It's evident that the Treasury Department wants to ensure that this is implemented faithful to the law, and they want to ensure that it is widely adopted and embraced. They are, as they repeatedly say, tax lawyers. They do not have education backgrounds. So as we've been talking about, it has been good that they've been taking input. So let's keep those comments flowing. Let's keep those conversations with Treasury happening, and let's keep explaining what this really is and how this really can and should work. As we wrap up, are there any actions that we haven't identified already that need to be taken in 2026? We've been talking about governors need to opt in. We've been talking about SGOs need to get organized. Organizations that want to form SGOs need to do it now. Any other urgent action? Oh, we need to stay engaged in the regulatory process. And when the NPRM comes out, likely in September, be ready to comment. What else?
let me just talk to taxpayer for a moment. I mean, my wife and I are going through this right now. Well, we know we're going to contribute to an SGO. We want to find one that really matches our values. I've spent my whole life trying to improve education in low income communities. So I'm looking for SGOs that will serve those children. We also have a lot of empathy for students with disabilities that are being very poorly served in the current system. So we may look for an SGO there. We're already seeing our money spread out between a few SGOs, and I'd encourage everybody to begin researching what their options for donations will be. And they should start talking to their employers like, how am I going to be able to do this through my paycheck rather than go to some portal and do a monthly, all of the rigmarole around that to make it easier.
Interesting. Peter, what about you? Action items for 2026?
I think there's just an ongoing effort to ensure that scholarship granting organizations and schools get connected, because that's going to determine the volume of this, how successful it is, and how many children benefit from it. And it sounds simple, but there's actually a lot involved in that, because everybody sort of does their 9-to-5 or day jobs. And this is going to take something extra, because the maximum you can give is $1,700 or hopefully $34 for a married couple. But the point being, you have to get a lot of donors to get engaged. A lot of people who don't donate, right? You don't have to itemize to donate. And a lot of lower income working and middle class people can't afford to donate. Well, now they can, because the donation costs them nothing. Maybe a cash flow issue, but the upshot is that schools and SGOs, the challenge they have that they need to be working on now, especially in a state that's opted in and even a state that has not, is to establish those relationships and partnerships, and everybody, staff, teachers, support staff, everyone at the school level needs to engage their parents and their larger communities to gear them up, to educate them so they're ready to donate, which again is something that they're not accustomed to doing in a large way. $1,700 is a lot of money. Not everybody has that discretionary money, but the beauty of this law is it creates new donors who don't normally donate at that level. They are key to making this a success. So there's enough scholarship money to flow to more children.
Well, as a longtime listener, Jim, you will know that we wrap up our Freedom to Learn episodes with a myth. And I like to ask my guests, what is the myth that bothers you the most that you'd like to dispel today? So, Jim, we'll start with you.
Thank you for the opportunity. I am the most loyal and longest listener
to your
podcast.
Thank you for that.
And but first time guest. And so I've heard every week, I've wondered, what would I say? I recognize that these myths are generated by the propaganda of the status quo, people who do not want reform. And so as I step back and I look at the myths that they promote, probably the most devastating to our efforts is the myth that public school kids are doing all right. And it's just not true. We have recently gotten, again, affirmation from our National Assessment of Educational Progress that about 30% of our children are not reading at a basic level, and they're not doing math at a basic level. And society needs to appreciate what happens to those children when they grow up. They are not they're not meeting their full God-given potential, that's for sure. But sometimes they're actually a problem for society. We have to fix this issue. We believe education freedom is key to doing that. And so that is the myth that I would really, more than anything else. I have several others, and if you give me a minute, I would say the myth around the role that the teacher unions are playing with their teachers is also a complete narrative that is falling apart. And we just watch as the membership in the teacher unions are declining over time. Teachers themselves are figuring out they're not really representing you very well anymore.
Well, Jim, I assure you that you will be welcome to come back and address more of your myths. I'm looking forward to hearing those. Peter, what's the myth that bothers you the most?
The biggest issue for me is this canard, this falsehood that school choice takes from public education. Not true. Public education consistently gets more every year, including in states with robust school choice, Florida, Arizona. Public education spending goes up. More spending per pupil in public schools also is the outcome of that. But that's also especially the case with this new federal law. This law is adding more to public education, not less. So my biggest myth is that it's somehow educational opportunity, parental choice is somehow less for public ed. It's not. The numbers don't say that, and it's especially false with respect to this new federal law, which will add more.
Well, Jim Blue and Peter Murphy, thank you for your commitment to education freedom, and thank you for joining Freedom to Learn.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Good to be here.
Take care.
Thank you.
Freedom to Learn is a production of the Defense of Freedom Institute. Learn more about our work at dfipolicy.org. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Send feedback, questions, and episode ideas to podcast@dfipolicy.org. And if you enjoyed today's conversation, please follow and review Freedom to Learn on your favorite podcast app and share it with a friend.